I woke up to the screech of chainsaws, the kind of sound that tears through sleep and sets your stomach on edge. And within minutes, the massive oak that had stood in my yard for a century and a half was crashing down, not onto my house, but straight through the roof of my neighbors. The tree that had shaded 3 generations of my family, the tree that had survived storms and droughts, was gone in an instant. And the woman who ordered it cut had the nerve to scream at me that it was my fault. That moment set off a storm that dragged me through police reports, HOA meetings, and finally into a courtroom where I had to fight for my own sanity against the most entitled neighbor I've ever met. When I first moved my family into Maple Grove, I thought we'd found the perfect balance: good schools, quiet, cul-de-sac, manicured lawns that looked safe for my kids to ride bikes on summer evenings. But what I didn't know then was that the neighborhood came with a self-appointed queen, our HOA president, Linda Carter. You couldn't miss her: helmet of blonde hair, pastel cardigan tight around her shoulders like armor, clipboard tucked under her arm like it was a badge. She thrived on rules, or, more accurately, on twisting them into weapons. If a mailbox leaned a fraction of an inch, she had a violation slip ready. If your lawn grew a half-inch too high, she was on your porch pointing it out like you'd committed a crime. But her obsession with me wasn't about grass or mailboxes. It was about the oak tree. This oak was older than every house in the subdivision combined. My grandfather had told me stories about settlers resting under its branches, about kids from decades ago carving their initials into its bark. It was more than a tree. It was history. A guardian that stood long before HOAs even existed. Linda hated it. She called it an eyesore, said it blocked her view, claimed the leaves were a hazard, even insisted squirrels nesting in its branches were a public health risk. At first, I laughed. My wife and I even collected her violation slips in a binder we called Linda's Greatest Hits. But her fixation grew darker. She whispered to neighbors that the oak would collapse and kill their families. She shoved violation letters into my mailbox weekly. And she cornered me one autumn evening and snarled, "If you don't take care of that tree, I will." I brushed it off. I told my son the oak would outlive all of us. But the truth? I underestimated how far Linda was willing to go. She wasn't bluffing. It happened just before sunrise. I heard the buzz, looked out the window, and saw 3 men with mismatched tools. No permits, no safety gear, hacking away at the base of my oak. I ran out barefoot, shouting, filming with my phone. Linda was standing on her driveway like a general at dawn, arms folded, clipboard in hand, lips curled into a smug smile. When I yelled that they were trespassing, that this tree was protected by law, she raised her chin and declared, "The board authorized emergency removal." That was a lie, and she knew it. The men didn't care. They worked faster as she barked orders. I'll never forget the sound, the groan of a tree older than our country's wars, leaning against the ropes tied to a pickup truck. For one breathless second, I prayed it would fall toward my yard, so at least I'd be the one cleaning up. But gravity had its own plan. The oak twisted, the ropes snapped, and 50 tons of wood collapsed onto Linda's house with a roar that shook the ground. Her roof folded in. Her car was flattened. Glass shattered. Alarms wailed. My oak was dead, and so was her facade of control. Neighbors poured out in pajamas, kids crying, adults whispering. Is this even legal? I kept filming, my heart split between grief and rage. Linda spun toward me, hair wild, cheeks blotchy, screaming, "Your tree destroyed my house! You'll pay for this!" And in that moment, I felt something I didn't expect: doubt. I looked at the stump, at the wreckage, and thought, maybe if I'd given in, maybe if I'd just cut it down, we wouldn't be here. Maybe my stubbornness was partly to blame. My wife put a hand on my shoulder, steadying me, but for hours after. I replayed that question. Did I do this to us by refusing to bend? But then reality snapped back. It wasn't me who crossed property lines in the dead of dawn. It wasn't me who hired unlicensed workers. It wasn't me who lied about permits. This was Linda's doing, and she was about to learn that consequences don't vanish just because you shout louder. Police cars arrived, sirens bouncing off the shattered windows of her home. I showed them my video, the fresh sawdust on my lawn, the property stakes inches from the stump. Neighbors gave statements. Some even had photos of Linda barking orders. The city arborist came and confirmed. The oak had been perfectly healthy, cut at the base with no sign of disease or storm damage. Linda sputtered about emergencies and negligence, but the officers weren't buying it. They asked for IDs, wrote reports, and promised to forward everything to the city attorney. I thought, maybe that was the end. Justice would take over, and Linda would finally retreat. I was wrong. 2 days later, I was served with a lawsuit. Linda was suing me for negligence, claiming the oak was a known hazard, that I ignored her repeated warnings, and that my failure to act caused catastrophic damage to her home. She wanted me to cover repairs, hotel stays, even emotional distress. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers in hand and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd it felt like a parody. My wife looked horrified, but I just shook my head. "This is classic Linda," I muttered. "She causes the chaos, then blames everyone else." The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions and documents. Linda strutted through the neighborhood like she'd already won, telling anyone who would listen that I'd soon be paying hundreds of thousands. She even printed copies of the lawsuit and slipped them into mailboxes. Some neighbors avoided me. Others whispered that maybe I really had ignored a hazard. For the first time, I felt the weight of her narrative pressing down. I'd wake at night thinking, what if the judge believes her? What if she buries me in paperwork until I can't fight anymore? That was my low point. The moment where I truly thought about giving up, about settling just to make it stop. But then I'd look at the cut stump in my yard, touch its rough surface, and remember, this wasn't my failure. This was her crime. So I fought. My lawyer and I built a case brick by brick. We pulled my vacation receipts showing I wasn't even home the morning of the cutting. We collected neighbor photos of Linda shouting at the crew. We subpoenaed the men she hired, and under oath, they admitted she paid in cash, told them to hurry before sunrise, and assured them the tree was hers to remove. We even found her late-night email to the HOA board. "I'm initiating an emergency removal at dawn. Don't worry. I'll handle it." By the time trial rolled around, I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry, and I was ready. The courtroom smelled like paper and polish. Linda showed up in a stiff blazer, trying to look like a victim instead of the tyrant we all knew. Her lawyer painted her as a mother terrified for her children's safety, abandoned by her negligent neighbor. She even faked tears, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she clearly brought for effect. Then it was my lawyer's turn. Calm, steady. He laid out the facts: trespass, destruction of property, illegal removal of a protected tree. We showed the video, the photos, the arborist's report, the contractor depositions, and finally, the photo of Linda, hands on her hips, smirking as the men cut into my oak, her face drained of color. Under cross-examination, she tried to spin new lies, but each one crumbled against the evidence. When asked if she had a permit, she whispered, "No." When confronted about telling police the tree fell naturally, then claiming in her lawsuit that I'd hired the men, she stammered, "I was confused." The judge didn't buy it. The verdict landed like a thunderclap. The court found me not liable for any damage to her property. Instead, Linda was found guilty of trespass and destruction of property. Damages awarded to me, $240,000, covering the appraised value of the oak, the cost of removal, attorney's fees, and punitive damages. Linda gasped like she'd been stabbed. Her lawyer slumped in his chair. She rose, wild-eyed, pointing at me one last time, shrieking, "You've ruined me," before the bailiff escorted her out, still raging as her voice echoed down the hall. I walked out of that courtroom lighter than I'd felt in months. Not triumphant, not gloating, just steady. I knew the oak was gone forever. But so was Linda's grip on the neighborhood. Word spread fast, and suddenly, the same people who'd whispered now nodded at me with quiet respect. Linda had to live under a sagging tarp while writing me checks each month. Bitter reminders of the consequences she brought on herself. And me? I kept a slice of that oak, polished into a tabletop. The ring's a map of resilience. Every time I run my hand over it, I remember what this war taught me, that being neighborly doesn't mean being a doormat, and that boundaries, once drawn, must be defended. The lesson I took from all of it is simple. When someone crosses the line and tries to make their problem your burden, don't cave, stand firm, because the truth, sooner or later, will cut deeper than any chainsaw.